Hi friends, so today we're going to graph cosine functions and look at what cosine functions look like. We're going to look at the amplitude, frequency, and period of those functions and kind of compare them to sine functions as well. So what I would like you guys to do, please pause this video, and I would like you in your calculator to take the cosine of 0, pi over 2, pi, 3 pi over 2, and 2 pi. So type it into your calculator, cosine of 0, and each one of those, and get me your values that your calculator gives you. So please pause this video and try this as a warm-up. All right, in your calculator, if you typed in cosine of 0, you should have gotten a value of 1. Now, if you didn't, you might be in the wrong mode. Remember, all of these are radian. So when you type this into your calculator, please make sure your calculator is in radian mode. Next one, if I type in the cosine of pi over 2, I should have gotten 0. Cosine of pi is -1. Cosine 3 pi over 2, I get 0. And cosine of 2 pi, I get 1. So what I want you guys to remember that these are an x and a y value. So I could take this and put it on my graph to graph it. Actually, this should say cosine. So let's graph the cosine curve, y equals cosine of x, over the domain from 0 to 2 pi. All this means is that these are our x values. So let's start graphing this. At 0, my y value is 1. So let's label our y-axis. I'm just going to go up a few boxes and label this 1. I see my minimum is -1, so I'm also going to label that -1. So at 0, I have a y value of 1. At pi over 2, I'm at 0. Pi is -1. Back to 0. And up at +1. So what I would like you guys to do, we did use our calculators a little bit kind of to get an idea of what our sine function looks like. So let's get an idea of what our cosine function looks like. In my calculator, if I type in y equals cosine of x, and I'm going to do zoom, and choice 7 is our trig function. So I'm going to do zoom trig, or zoom 7. If I look at this, this looks very similar to our sine function, except now it's starting at its maximum value. It's no longer starting at the midline. So it's the same curvy kind of looking graph, but it's starting at its maximum. Now, some things I want to mention. If I put a number like a 5 in front of this cosine function, just like we knew happened on sine functions, cosine functions, that number in front changes how high and how low. It's actually cut off a little bit on my window, so if I change this, let's say to -6 and 6, then we could see that whole curve of our function. So just like sine functions, I have an amplitude on this function, which is the number in front, and that tells me how high and how low my graph goes. I could also put something with this. So if I change this to a 6x, I'm going to see 6 cycles in 2 pi. So when I graph this, I see a lot more of those cycles happening. Again, my window is not from 0 to 2 pi, so I would have to play around with that if I wanted to kind of see exactly what I would see. So let's do that. If I go to my y equals and I type in cosine of x, I'm going to go to my window and I want to change this because they told me I want to graph from 0 to 2 pi. So if I type in 0 to 2 pi in your calculator and hit graph, you will see exactly what our graph should look like. So it's starting at that point, the maximum, and it's making a curve or kind of a cup around. So I like to say that cosine functions form a cup. Now, when you graph this, do not make them a point like this. They are not pointy graphs. It is a curve. We call them a cosine curve and a sine curve. So when you connect them, please try to curve this as much as possible. Now, standard form for our cosine function is y equals a cosine of bx. And this a value and this b value, just like we saw in sine functions, are going to affect our graph. So the a value is our amplitude, and the b value is our frequency. Let's take a look at a first example. We're going to do just like we did with sine functions, except now we're going to graph the cosine functions, or really just sketch them. So let's take a look. Amplitude is the number that is in front. In this case, my amplitude is 3. Let's start sketching this so that I have an idea. This is a positive cosine function. Cosine functions, which I saw, start at the maximum. They go down to the midline, minimum, midline, and then maximum. So when I sketch this, I'm going to make this cup-looking sketch. If you would like, when you sketch this, you can do it from your points, if you know the order of these points that it goes. But just when you do this, make sure when you connect it, you make it a little bit of a curve. So either way you want to do that, I am fine with it. We need to label our x and y axes. So the first thing I would like you to do is label your amplitude once we have our graph. Our amplitude tells us from our midline that I go up 1, 2, 3 to get to my maximum, and I go down 1, 2, 3 to get to my minimum. That's how I graph my y-axis. To graph your x-axis, I now have to figure out what my period is. We use our frequency to help us. So again, I'm just going to write this standard form, y equals a cosine of bx, just so we're aware of what a and b are. Our frequency is just this b value. So my frequency is 2. My period is a formula that you do need to get familiar with because we are going to be using it for the rest of the unit. My period is the formula 2 pi divided by b, which is why we need to know that this number with the x is the b value. So in this case, my period is 2 pi over, my b value is 2, and this simplifies just 2 pi. Your period, we do need to know this formula, and we do need to know what it means. Your period is your length of one cycle. Why this is important is I sketched one cycle of this function, so I need to label at the end of my x-axis, that's where the end of the one cycle ends, is pi. So my length of one cycle is pi. Again, very similar to your sine function, except now the graph looks a little different, but I am labeling my x and my y axes, still using my amplitude and my period. So let's look at one more example. In this case, again, my amplitude is the number in front, or this a value, but it's always the absolute value of that. So your amplitude is 2. What this negative does, just like any other function, like sine functions, like parabolas, like polynomial functions, this negative in front is going to reflect over the x-axis. So our normal sine function looks like what we did in 1. But now I have a negative sine function. So if I'm reflecting this over the x-axis, instead of starting at its maximum point, I'm going to start at its minimum point. And it's still going to make a cup, but it's going to make an upside down cup, something looking like that. Actually going to make that look a little better. So it starts at its minimum, makes a cup, and goes back down to its minimum. If I want to label this, the first thing that I do have is my amplitude, so I know my maximum point is up at 2, and my minimum point is down at -2. Now, I just want to mention, these are sketches, so they're not going to be perfect. I don't have actual graph paper here. I'm just making an idea of what this looks like, so just a sketch of what this looks like. So obviously, this distance isn't exactly perfect. You know, the top one's a little bigger, but that is okay. We're not focusing so much on that. I want you guys to just focus on what the basic shape of this looks like and labeling approximately where they are. So the next thing I need to be able to label is my y-axis. So if I'm labeling, we have our y-axis. Now I need to label my x-axis, which my frequency is going to help me with that. My frequency is 3. That tells me there's 3 cycles in 2 pi, but I'm not graphing 3 cycles. I'm only graphing 1 cycle. So I need to use my period to help me find the length of that 1 cycle. My period is 2 pi over b, which in this case is 2 pi over 3. That cannot be simplified, so that is what my period, or in other words, my length of this one cycle is. Just to kind of think about it and compare, if I did have a graph and I did have these 1, 2, 3 cycles, 3 cycles would end in 2 pi. Again, we're only graphing one cycle, but I just kind of wanted to put that idea together for you so you understand the difference between frequency and period. What I would like you guys to do now is please try these 3 practice questions, and tomorrow when I post the answer, you can check them. Have a great one. Bye.